Storytelling in general, I think, is incredibly important.
For me, storytelling is really about connection.
I think storytelling is very important, not just publicly, but socially.
A vocal story, an oral story, has such power to it.
It teaches people how to live a better life because the stories have meaning. They have morals. They have a lesson to learn.
Anytime you hear other people tell stories, it sparks your imagination.
Every single person in the audience will see a different story. They'll see different people, they'll see different places, but they'll all remember the story.
Knowing that there's an opportunity for people to tell stories is important.
An important element in our society that we have overlooked and I think we're losing. We just have to work to make sure it's back.
I try to keep history alive by attaching a story to it that people will want to listen to.
And, to me, entertaining is almost like it's a calling.
I've been a storyteller forever, practically. I started telling stories when I babysat because I was young and the kids were close to my age, and I found out that if I told them a story, they'd go to bed for me. If they didn't go to bed when they were supposed to and stay, then they didn't get a story the next time I came.
I recall my dad especially telling stories at the kitchen table after we'd eaten supper.
My grandfather, Jimmy Crow Wallen, whom I was named after, was by far the best tall tale teller I ever knew. He was so good at pulling you into all the places you knew, all the people you knew, and then just whopping you upside the head with the punchline to the story. So I grew up in this rich oral heritage.
I'm told I've been doing storytelling since I could talk. I'm the oldest kid in my family and in the extended family, and we had parents and uncles and aunts and grandparents who told stories. So when there wasn't a grown-up around, the other kids looked at me and expected me to be able to tell stories.
I've always told stories, but now I get paid instead of get punished.
I tell stories as part of my work in the library.
I was a children's librarian. That's one of the common paths for storytelling. And so as a children's librarian, some of the other librarians said, "Hey, we're going to a school to tell stories. You want to come?" And I said, "Okay." And they said, "You want to tell a story?" And I said, "Okay." And then one of them showed me a story, a book that had some good stories in it. He said, "You might like some of these." It was a collection of stories by Philippa Pierce, and I flipped through, and there was a story called The Crooked Little Finger. I have them. And so I thought, I'll tell that one. So I told that story at a school, and another story that I'd made up when I was 13, and the kids liked it, and they clapped, and I liked it, and I thought, I want to do this some more.
And I saw a little blurb in the paper. Steve Otto, storyteller. You're telling stories at the First National Bank of Missouri in Gladstone, just up the road from where I lived. I said, great, I can go hear a storyteller. And I turned and asked my wife, asked my daughters, do you want to go listen to a storyteller with me? And my wife was busy doing something. My daughters, I think, were watching a video. Fine, I left. Steve is sort of like a Pied Piper. He wasn't necessarily just telling stories. He was recruiting for the group, River and Prairie Story Weavers. And he helped me learn a couple of stories. I came home. 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. My oldest daughter, who is 12 going on 30, met me at the door saying, "Where have you been?" And I'm thinking, this is wrong. You know, she's the child. I'm the adult. And I still felt compelled to answer her. So I said, I went to hear the storyteller, and I even learned a couple of stories, and I thought that was going to be the end of it. But apparently their video was over. She sat down on the couch next to her sister. Fine, tell us a story. Arms crossed. This is a tough audience. And I started telling the first story I learned, Shep the Cow Dog. Tried to remember it word for word as I had read it. It was pretty bad. But it was good enough that they wanted to listen. They wanted to hear a second story, so I told the second story. word for word as I'd read it. It was pretty bad. They wanted to hear a third story. I only knew 2 stories. So I asked them about their story, and all of a sudden they jumped in to tell me a story. My wife jumped in to tell me a story. And all of a sudden the TV wasn't on, and we were telling stories around the table, and it was a way of sharing each other's lives and coming together. And that's what drew me to storytelling.
I had a grandfather who spoke in narrative. He couldn't communicate without a little joke, a vignette, a story, and I think I grew up as a child assuming that's how you communicate. You have to tell stories. Now later in life, when I entered the ministry and then went to seminary and training, narrative style preaching fit me, and that was partly a discovery by having people respond to me by saying, you know that story you told, or they would tell their story.
I've been a storyteller for a long time, but I really intensified it when I retired. And I started working with the Audrain County Historical Society, and we founded a living history event called the Walk Back in Time. It's once a year, and it's very educational and all based in history. It's a timeline of American history, and I would do most of my storytelling there in that historical setting.
Things that a history professor showed me in college, where he would get people to remember the most amazing combinations of historical events because he would tell them in the form of a story or a joke that was absolutely unforgettable. And after that I realized, you know, the parts of history that people remember are the parts where there's a story attached.
In my own storytelling work, I'm working with a 5th grade teacher at my neighboring school, trying to find stories she can use to teach 5th grade math. And we also have found that her students' reading scores have gone up almost alarmingly since I began doing story retelling activities with them.
I was at the library and I saw a notice for a storytelling workshop, and my friend at the time performed as a clown. I said, you ought to go check this out, maybe we'll pick some things up. And she said, well, she didn't want to go by herself, so I said, I'll go with you. So I went along initially just as a lark for something to do, something different.
One day my wife decided, she came home from a meeting at school, and she had a brochure from University of Missouri, Kansas City, saying storytelling for teachers. And she said, I think you should take that class with me. And I looked at her and I said, Virginia, I am an actor. I don't go to the library on Saturday mornings and read little books to the kiddies. Which she remarked back, I think you should take this class. I immediately decided, after 25 years of living with her, that yes, I think I should take that class. And so I did. I fell in love with the concept of story, being able to move story from inside me to inside my audience.
I first started in the schools in 1983 when my nephew said, Uncle Jim, will you come to my school and bring all your stuff? So I was his show and tell for the day, and I told a couple of mountain man stories and showed a lot of artifacts I'd been collecting.
As a child I was very sick once, and one of the things my parents gave me were books of folklore to read because I couldn't leave the house for a couple of weeks. I had already learned a lot of fairy tales. They read me a lot of those when I was very young. But in that particular time I sort of immersed myself heavily in folk tales.
Oh, late 70s and early 80s is when we first started having storytellers come to our school. And we just love them. Anyway, I guess that's really what drew me, was the storytellers that came and performed at our school.
When I started telling stories, I picked up an article, or picked up a paper and was glancing through it, sitting at 15th and Walnut at the old Goodyear store. And here's an article that says, How to Become a Professional Storyteller.
The first Nebraska Storytelling Festival, actually I guess it was the second one, and I was substitute teaching and I got a flyer out and I thought, boy, doesn't that sound fun? And I went to it, had a blast, and then became involved in Omaha's Guild, the Omaha Organization for the Purpose of Storytelling. And that eventually led me to raps.
I guarantee you, if you have a good entertainer on stage, storyteller, musician, whatever, nobody in that audience is thinking about their aches or their pains or their bills or their problems or their arguments or their relatives. It's like all of their problems are wiped away for however long that show goes on.
Oh, that is such a hard question. My favorite type of story.
You're a storyteller. What you have in your head and your pockets is all you've got.
I'm a school librarian, so I involve storytelling in my classes because I believe that our children are very deficient in listening. Everything is done visually for them, so I like to encourage their imagination by the use of storytelling.
I love little tiny kids, like 2, 3 years old. I have a certain kind of story for them. I like elementary. I really love high school. You know, you can't always tell if they're listening, but if they're not slumped down asleep, I figure they're listening. I tell to a lot of Alzheimer patients or residents in care facilities.
When I'm working with kids, I tell mainly traditional folk tales, although sometimes I'm asked to do historical pieces with them.
And funny stories, I always like them.
I love to tell stories from the Cajun tradition because that's my heritage.
I do like to tell personal stories about growing up in Kansas City, childhood stories, stories about my dad, my grandma.
In general, my focus is on environmental stories, and I work with park naturalists and zoo docents and people like that, teaching them to tell stories so that they can use them in their work.
Spanish is my field, so I told a lot of my experiences in Latin America.
I dearly love to tell ghost stories. There's nothing like watching your audience as you tell a ghost story, and suddenly they're experiencing the ghost story. They're not just hearing it.
To me, my perfect audience is a 4th grader. And they have an attention span of about 15 minutes. And they want a nice picture as they're going, and they kind of like it to be fun when you're getting there, and they'd like to be nice and quick when you're going. And then when you get all done, you get to laugh at yourself. And that's my favorite kind of story, which is what I do best.
Ghost stories, scary stories are my favorites.
My very favorite is stories from history. I also enjoy doing the Ozark Tall Tales because of my grandfather and growing up in that tradition. But my very favorite is doing stories from history. So this is a recreation of an early 1800s Rocky Mountain fur trapper.
I do lean toward funny, but not always, so that doesn't really work. And I like scary stories, but not always, so that doesn't work.
I do more music than storytelling, frankly, but most of my songs have a story to go along with them. So even when I go somewhere to play music, there will be a story or two told, and often there'll be a story attached to each song. Maybe not a long one, but here's what this song's about, that sort of thing.
I love outdoor ed. You take 6th graders out to a dark woods where they don't know where they're at, and you tell them stories that make them nervous. It's, there's definitely a God with that one.
For me, a story has to have some underlying thread that is significant for me.
When I work with adults, I do primarily historical pieces, where I take a piece of history and weave it into a story.
In addition to the Walk Back in Time, I do a lot of living history events, a lot of them. During the warm months, it's almost every weekend. I'm out to some kind of a park or an event that has some kind of a historical element to it, and then I set up a living history display in anything from World War I all the way back to colonial. And there I have quite a repertoire of stories, and I will tell stories in that setting.
I think, though, to tell stories, I am most comfortable and most drawn to folk tales. Those are tried and true stories.
The folk tales, of course, literary stories. There's some literary stories I love to adapt.
And of course the other, just the basic tall tale, the story that starts out entirely believable and just slowly goes off out of the reservation. And the trick is to see how long you can maintain the belief of the audience until finally say, hey, wait a minute, what's this you're giving me? And then of course from there you can go as far as you want. But that's what I like to tell.
I do like the really old ghost stories, the ones that are written long ago, you know, Bram Stoker. And
I want the listeners to walk away remembering the story. I don't care so much if they walk away remembering me, but I want them to remember that story. I don't want them to walk away saying, so what? What was that about? I want them to remember the story.